You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. This is a holiday episode, and we're saying goodbye to 2024, and we'll see you again next year in the new year. Well, I'm a fan of beer history because I like to know why I'm drinking things, and there's one historian that I really like, Brian Alberts, who's been on before, and it's definitely worth talking to and reading what he's written. That's a funny intro, but Brian, it's my way of saying I really respect the work that you're doing, and I'm looking forward to this conversation today about an aspect of beer history that I like because it talks a lot about working class and different aspects of beer. So, Brian Alberts, just give us a quick intro, and we'll talk about your new theme, which is beer riots.
Oh my God. Thank you so much. That's very kind, Jimmy. And I'm really glad that you like my work. It's great to be back. Really excited to talk about this. And so for anyone who's not familiar, I'm Brian Alberts. I'm a historian who studies beer in context, which basically means I look at all the things that happen around beer, mostly in American history, but like today, I kind of venture outside the border a little bit now and then. And so, today I want to talk about riots that took place over the price of beer, sometimes very small increases in the price of beer, in Germany throughout the 19th century, kind of even before Germany was a country as we think of it today, when it was still, this hodgepodge of many other like smaller kingdoms and duchies and principalities and what have you. I'm going to dig into that, but first I'm just saying hello and really excited to be here.
Well, Brian, Munich and Germany, we're talking 1840s. I remember a few years ago, we did a story about someone who attempted to only drink beer, live off beer during Lent for 40 days.
Oh, my
and we've
goodness.
talked about different beer styles that you could live on. Doppelbock seemed to be a style that might have been closer to what a monk would have drinking. But this idea of beer as a nourishing beverage, beer as a wage, beer as this like the one benefit of these guys' lives. That's some of the things that are behind this riot and the working class component of it. So why don't you dive in and give us some background on what beer meant? So all these workers in Munich in the 1840s.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're talking about is I'm going to have kind of an exemplar riot that I talk about today, which is Munich's beer riot of 1844. But I want to stress that this is not just a single event. This is a trend that happens. There's kind of an uptick between the 1840s and the 1870s, where there's just this repeated pattern of beer riots across southern and western Germany, or what is now Germany. And as Jimmy's already been kind of hinting at, that this very much gets into kind of the role that beer played in the lives of lower and working class people in Bavaria, in Baden, in Württemberg, during these time periods where, if you're a working class laborer, beer is not just a nice drink you have after work with your buddies. It is integral to your social life. It is integral to your diet. Actually, fairly regularly, when you're having a meal during your workday, at least one of your meals is likely to be just beer, like just one or two Mass sizes, which is about a liter, one or two Mass of beer is likely to be your entire meal. And sometimes it's two of your meals during the day. And so these people are also not making a ton of money. These people are also living in pretty bad conditions. I mean, I know rent in New York is pretty nuts, but what these people were dealing with is they're paying for a one room, and they're sharing that room with six people, and there's only one bed in the room. So this is not a great living condition for a lot of these people. These are day laborers, these are seasonal laborers, these are lower class laborers who are working in the city. And a lot of the time, the the tavern, the brewery, the tasting room, whatever you want to call it, is not just a third place. It's like the third place. It's the place that you want to be all day, because home isn't a place you want to go, and you don't want to work all day. And so the beer hall is where you form your social bonds. It's where you relax. It's where you spend as much time as you can that is not eaten up by your working life. And so these people are very price sensitive. These people are really devoted to what they would call a Krugerechtigkeit. I apologize to any actual Germans who just blanched at my pronunciation. But this Krugerechtigkeit is basically it is the belief that a person has a right to nourishing, healthy, accessible, and reasonably priced beer. And this is not just a nicety. This is a fact of life, and you don't mess with it unless you want to mess with the people that believe in this. And so that kind of sets the stage for how important this is. But I also want to stress that, these beer riots are taking place not just in a vacuum, but they're also taking place during a period of food sensitivity throughout much of Europe. A big example being like the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. But that was one slice of a larger pie, where food was getting scarce in many different parts of Europe, and the region that became Germany was included in that. And so these beer riots take place against a backdrop of wider food riots over the price of wheat, riots over the availability of potatoes and other staples. And so it all goes back to this idea that, well, food is something people need. Hey, go figure. And when capitalism, or when greedy merchants, or when structural forces that aren't any one person's fault are threatening the food supply, these lower classes have uh, they have a right to do something about it. They have a right to secure their livelihoods. And I know I'm getting really abstract. There's a whole history, there's a whole historiography about how these riots and disturbances are studied. But I just want to kind of emphasize, this is not just something over that when a riot over beer takes place, it's a double for riots over livelihoods. It's a metaphor for standing up against injustices that are either structural or brought on by oppressive authority forces.
Or that extra dollar for the beer just pushes you over the top. Let's just take a step back and
talk I know I'm getting in the weeds.
Well, no, you're amazing. And what's neat about this case is that we're not talking about prohibition or temperance. We're not talking about beer as evil. We're talking about good beer, whatever this old-fashioned style of beer is, that could be considered nourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, in some cases, it was the wages as well.
Absolutely. Yep.
Were they paid in beer? Because I know, like in the Revolutionary War, you hear about other stories where soldiers are paid in beer or rum or cider. Were they paid in beer, or were they paid in just enough wages to buy the beer?
They were paid in currency. We're talking about kreutzers in this case. That was the unit of currency at the time. That there are instances in history where people are paid in literal, forms of alcohol, like rum, like you mentioned. The British Navy and their rum ration is a very popular example. These laborers were getting paid in currency, but at the same time, beer was it was right on that edge between accessible and too expensive, to where these people were getting paid however many, maybe to 25 to 40 kreutzers a day, according to research by Kim Newak Carpenter, who wrote amazing research on this. Got to plug her name. Anyway, but they're getting paid 25 to 40 kreutzers a day. But keep in mind, a beer at this time costs sometimes 5.5, but more likely like 6 kreutzers, and they're drinking 2 to 3 a day. So that's 18 kreutzers out of maybe 25 that you're making. You might be making more than that. You might be making 40, but either way, you're very easily spending around half of your daily wage on beer that you're drinking that day. And that's before
it wasn't that they weren't profligate. It wasn't like they were just drinking away their earnings. You're just saying they didn't make that much, but then also the price of the beer would have really mattered to these workers.
Absolutely. And what's more is that this was not like just like a market system. The price of beer was legally mandated. So there were two prices for beer that alternated every 6 months, or well, not exactly 6 months. It was they alternated in November 1st and they alternated on May 1st between winter and summer beer. Winter beer was a little bit cheaper because it was a little bit easier to make. The summer beer was better quality, but it was a little more expensive as a result. The kind of beer we're talking about, just to situate this in time, if we're talking 1840s Munich, this is before the Helles Lager, which was invented 50 years later. This Märzens, that the Oktoberfest style amber Märzen, that was kind of just being invented around that time in Munich, but just kind of entering the scene. Most of the beer that we're talking about would be something like a German style Dunkel Lager. So it's like deep brown, kind of muddy looking lager. Very tasty, by the way. I love them. Or something like a Doppelbock, like I believe you've already mentioned. And yeah, the price was federally mandated. It was this kind of complicated equation of taxes that were involved and the market price of things like barley, and other ingredients for the beer. And they would also have little subsidies. They would have little excise taxes. It's like a vice tax on the beer in order to pay for government projects, all this kind of stuff. And then the other side of this little complicated system was that the government, which was a monarchy at this time, it was a kingdom of Bavaria, they would have these little kickbacks, not kickbacks, but these little subsidies that they would give to civil servants or to soldiers in the army. So, a beer costs 6 kreuzers, but each soldier gets a little bit of a rebate, like a daily, a per diem, something like that they can kind of put towards their beer. They get it off, get it deducted from the price they pay and stuff like that. There's a weird little complicated system that, the laborers were just kind of beholden to, and every few months there would be this proclamation of the beer price is going to be this now. And they're like, oh, I hope that's okay. And starting in the early 1840s, as some of these famines started to, price shocks and famines, when labor started getting, or work started getting a little more scarce, things like that, the price of beer starts creeping up and these laborers aren't making any more money. Boy, who's heard a story like this before? And, suddenly it's well, the price is too expensive. What do you want us to do? And they start getting angry. They start grumbling. And, this doesn't erupt in a riot in a day. These riots are planned, weeks in advance. Sometimes it's a surprisingly deliberative and coordinated process.
Well, just going back to the beer, the nourishing beer, those styles, tell us more about the beer. Were they unfiltered? Did they have, higher, was the mash different? Because I when I think of those styles, you feel like you do get fuller. They're not light beers. But is there anything about the technique or just the composition of the beer that you think could have carried? These guys were workers. They're guys and they're workers, and they're working more physically than we do. What was the composition of the beer that would have made them, carry them through the day?
Well, these are darker beers. They are a little bit heartier. They're going to have a lot more malt content to them, and all kind of the various, proteins and carbohydrates of the malt were going to be a little bit more present there. Part of the reason I mentioned, that the Helles Lager hadn't been invented yet, the Pilsner had just kind of been invented a couple years earlier, but that now you're talking about in Bohemia, not necessarily quite in Germany yet. So, and the reason I keep bringing those up is because those are, those beers are lighter, they're clearer, they're more of that fizzy yellow character. And that's a trend that taste would adopt. And that's kind of what we think of a lot when we think about mass produced beer at this time. That didn't exist then just yet, at least not in Munich. If they existed at all, they were still these kind of small scale, just entering the scene type of beers. And so, yeah, the beers prior to that, anyone who's had a Doppelbock knows that it's this thicker, heartier beer than anything that's, more in that light yellow range. And yeah, so, Germans at the time, they absolutely believed that beer was nutritional, that it was a food product that would, impart nutrition and be part of a diet. That's something we don't like to acknowledge today. And that's not something I'm going to, try and back up as a statement. I'm not qualified to do that. But but the idea was, that the malt content, the much richer, heartier, I don't want to say thicker, but heartier content of the beer was a big deal. And yeah, for someone who was going to be working the rest of the day, it definitely had a lot more calories than, your Paulaner Helles that you might find today if you go to Munich.
It takes me back to the style of the Schneider, the Aventinus, which is like a
Mhm,
Doppelweizenbock.
mhm.
And I remember when I was just getting into beer over 25 years ago, it was an Oktoberfest with German artists I had at my old bar. And I think I drank 8 of those large
Holy cow.
Aventinus
Yep.
Doppelweizenbocks. And it was a meal. I really felt
Yeah.
like satisfied. And, I did have quite a buzz. But um, if you try to picture, or just a classic Doppelbock, I'm picturing these styles. They may or may not have had more alcohol, but they were definitely, they had
Mhm.
more calories for sure.
Absolutely,
Um,
yeah, yeah. Alcohol, we're probably talking in the I don't know, 4 to 5 and then maybe like 7, 8 range if you're talking about Doppelbock, but, not all the beer was that heavy. Some of it would have been more in like the kind of 4 and 5% range at the time, I believe.
yeah. Well, it's
Yep.
it's it's pretty wild. Tell me more about it because honestly, I've got your notes.
Mhm.
Working men didn't just rely on beer; they believed they had a Kreugerrecht to Geit, the right
That's
to
a
good
word.
and healthy beer. It was a core element of Bavaria's social contract, and it was
Mhm.
binding.
Yes. Oh, boy, you read that article I wrote. Yes, it was, absolutely, and, it's interesting that you brought up the Schneider Brewery, because if you go to Munich, I was hoping to mention this sometime. If you go to Munich ever for vacation or anything like that, near downtown is it's the Schneider Weisse like restaurant and like tap room or whatever. I'm not using the proper German terms for this, but it's a little bit of like a tourist attraction, but it's this nice fancy restaurant. It's like on a street corner. It's along Tallstrasse, if anyone's familiar with Munich. And it's right near the city center, right near Marienplatz, where the big Glockenspiel is and everything like that. But anyway, if you go there, that is actually the epicenter of where Munich's 1844 riot took place. That is literally the heart of town that we're talking about. And that street that it's on, Tallstrasse, that used to be it's still kind of an artery street for the city center, but it was an artery street, back in the 1840s as well. And it linked, the more prosperous city center with the working class neighborhoods that fed a lot of the rioters' ranks. If you walk up and down that street, the Tallstrasse, you eventually get to the Isar River. I'll come back to that in a minute. But it was a direct link right across that river was I and Heidhausen, two kind of neighborhoods that are a little trendy today, but back then they were almost like slums. It was where all the working class people went every night to sleep. Um, and where the Schneider Weiss restaurant is now used to be a different brewery called the Materbräu. And the Materbräu was an incredibly popular, kind of centrally located brewery that was one of these third places where these laborers would meet and where they would kind of live out as much of their lives as they could. That wasn't work or home. In 1844, when the beer price got announced that it was going up to 6.5 kreuzers per Maß, which was a breaking point price, and the working classes decided that this was going to be the topic that they rallied around to finally kind of vent this pent up frustration over the precariousness of their working lives and their financial lives. The Marderbräu was their primary target, and that's where it took place.
So just a little translation. So the
Mhm.
single mass of beer, about
Yes.
what size would that be today? Is that a liter?
It's the same size it is today. If you go to Germany, it's about a liter. It's like 1.05 liters or something. It's very, very close.
Believe. So if back then, if the six quotes price was
Mhm,
close to breaking for their budgets,
mhm.
uh, like what is that comparable to today for like a pint? Would that be expecting
Ooh.
to pay a $9 or $10 pint or less than that?
But that's a good question. It is really hard to transfer across currencies, across a couple of dead currencies, and with all the inflation. The best kind of barometer I can have for that is American newspaper coverage of this riot at the time. The price increase was half a kreutzer, 6 to 6.5. That half a kreutzer was something like 1/3 of an American cent at the time per Maß. So I mean, and 1 cent at the time was not like 1 cent today. It was worth a lot more, relatively speaking. Adjusting for inflation and everything. But that is not a huge price increase. And so one of the significance of that is not, you don't take away from that, oh my goodness, Bavarians were so sensitive that they freak out over something so small. What it was more, it was the straw that tipped the camel's back is really the better way to think about it, because grumblings over the price of beer and kind of public statements criticizing the king were very dangerous to make, legally speaking, back at that time, had been bubbling up for at least a year before this took place. And even like little, brawls have been breaking out in taverns over it and everything like that. It's just that when this May 1st, 1844 price change was coming up and it was announced in advance, they started coordinating and planning their activities in kind of a ritualistic way. And the way they did that's actually really, really cool.
So is May 1st just a coincidence? I mean, I've heard that's called May Day, and there used to be some worker activism. Was this in tune with that, or was this an early version of like a May Day protest?
I don't think it was connected to May Day specifically, but May 1st was the day that price changes took effect. So they would announce that the price was going up, but it wasn't going to actually go up until May 1st. So that's why they chose that day. In particular, in 1844, there was something else big that was going on, which was the marriage of King Ludwig's daughter. So King Ludwig had been, he's part of the very influential Wittelsbach family that ruled Bavaria for a very long time. And so King Ludwig is also the guy we can thank for having Oktoberfest, because he and his wife, their marriage in 1813 or 1810. But their marriage is the one that caused the initial Oktoberfest celebration some 30 years before this. And now he's king, but he's not necessarily making everyone quite as happy as that first Oktoberfest did. But now his daughter's getting married, and the marriage day is May 1st, and that's also a little part of the story too. Do you want me to sink into it, or?
Yeah, no, let's get into it. I mean, I read about it, and it seemed that there were simmering class issues.
Absolutely.
And the wedding kind of pushed it to the forefront. Is that true?
Yeah, it is. The wedding was kind of a proxy for King Ludwig's, rule as a whole. And it really kind of illustrates the complicated dynamics of this, because these Bavarians were angry and they wanted to do something, and they were, focusing on the beer price as their impetus to act. But they also they weren't just becoming like unruly mob or like anarchists or anything like that. And so and that literally plays out on May 1st and on May 2nd, because these lower class Germans, they coordinate and they plan. They all plan to arrive at the Marderbräu and dozens of other breweries and beer halls around Munich at that time, but they wait until after Hildegard is her name, the Ludwig's daughter. They wait until after Hildegard actually has her wedding ceremony to do anything. They let the city stay quiet while that's going on, but then they act immediately after. And they still talk about it. They still talk about what the king's doing. They talk about how the marriage celebrations are, which, this is a king getting married in a kingdom. So, the marriage is also a public spectacle, right? But all the public spectacles are in the wealthy neighborhoods. There's no parades that include working class neighborhoods. There's no city decorations that include them. And these people feel like they're being forgotten, and they feel like the beer price just is hammering that in and making it even worse. So they don't want to not be Bavarians. They don't want to topple the monarchy, but they want to make themselves heard. And so there's this kind of interesting dynamic where they wait for the wedding to finish, and then they trash the city, which is, I think, hilarious.
And what did they do? I mean, did they burn things? Did they just smash beer glasses? What did they break?
It is targeted violence. So there's literally kind of a ritual to this, which I have to describe because it's going to matter beyond even just this Munich example, where groups of soldiers or just laborers or both, they go into these beer halls and they make a big ruckus. They make themselves very prominent, and everyone's noticing them. And then they go up to the poor server who's just doing their job, and they basically, they order a beer, and then they say, "But I'm only going to pay 5 kreuzers for it." instead of 6 or 6.5 or whatever the price is. And they basically they decide what a fair price is, and they insist that they're going to pay that and nothing more. And they basically make this poor server, have to be like, well, I have to ask you for more money than that. And then all the riders, or the about to be riders, as soon as that happens, they go, well, you asked for it then. And they go into an uproar. They start flipping over tables. They start smashing glasses. They start throwing stones through windows, things like that. And this is not just like one or two people. This is like a crowd. And even if there's only like half a dozen or so that go into the beer hall and do this, performative show for everyone, they got a crowd of 30 more of them outside the door, And so in a couple of cases, there are, a couple gendarmes, which is, just the term for police at the time. There's a couple of them nearby. It's not a secret that stuff might go down, but there's 3 of them, and 30 rioters. There's only so much they can do. And so basically these places immediately go into an uproar. They do very targeted violence. They destroy the implements of beer sales, the glasses, the chairs, the furniture, the windows, things like that. They don't do the brewing equipment. They don't go after brewing equipment if they're in an actual brewery. They also generally, outside of, they're probably yelling at them or something like that, but they're not physically harming like brewers or brewery workers or the servers in most cases. Occasionally it happens, but it's usually because the brewery workers try and intervene. There's also opposite cases where the brewer's there and he's like, guys, you got to go. And they basically say, if you walk out the back door right now and just leave us alone, we're not going to touch you. And the brewer usually at that point takes a look at the crowd and goes like, okay. And then after that, they kind of inflict their more ritualistic violence on the brewery after that. Now, the big question here is, why isn't anyone stopping them? Especially if there were grumblings in advance, especially if there was kind of notice or rumor about this stuff happening. Well, for one thing, Munich is not employing very many police. There's maybe 115 of them on duty that day for a city of 90,000 people. Not great numerically. And also, they ask soldiers, military soldiers who are garrisoned in the city for help, but they don't get the help because usually about half of the crowd is made up of soldiers who are off duty. And when the soldiers who are on duty are sent in to intervene, they either see their friends on the other side and they're like, well, I'm not going to really attack my friends. Or literally, they are offered beer by the crowd. The crowd's like, well, hey, we're in this brewery. We got all this free beer. You want some? And there's literally examples of the soldiers kind of being sent to confront them. The crowd just offers them a beer. They kind of clink glasses, drink it, and then the soldiers leave. So
it's like the Munich Spring.
Pretty much.
Different. Not in that context, but Arab Spring, you got this, something like that.
Absolutely. Yep.
Wow. But talking about the soldiers, again, back to your article. You're talking about this cash-strapped government soldiers. So they're also none of these working people make that much money. So they really live kind of, beer glass to bed, work beer glass bed.
Yep.
But it said that there was another thing. There was a daily subsidy given to each soldier to offset the purchase of beer. So again, they weren't paid in beer, but they were paid in, it's a Zulaga, a small daily subsidy to offset the purchase of beer.
Yeah, that's that kind of per diem, like rebate type of thing that I mentioned earlier. And the soldiers would get a Zulaga. That was not a whole lot. It was like 2 pennies, and a kreutzer was a kreutzer was 3.5 pennies. Don't ask me why it was a half instead of a whole number. But anyway, so it wasn't a huge amount, but it was there, and they absolutely made use of it. And so, in probably one of the demonstrations of little foresight that go down in history, the government canceled the Zulaga for soldiers shortly, like a couple weeks before they raised the price on everyone and caused this riot. So all the soldiers who were sent from the city to try and quell this uprising over the price of beer had literally had their beer subsidy canceled a couple weeks before. You can imagine they weren't especially motivated on this particular issue to back the government. So yeah, that was not the most forward-thinking move at the time, but yeah, it contributed to why the Munich beer riot of 1844 lasted for 3 days. It's because the soldiers didn't really intervene, and these gendarmes, power to them, but they were just overwhelmed by the number of it. And so, yeah, these these mobs, they trash one brewery, they trash the Marderbräu, then they just, parade through the streets and go to the next one. In total, some 30 breweries in Munich are attacked and suffer either damage or near total destruction. And that's just the first day. The next day, again, the rioters, they wait. There's a parade through the city for Hildegard for her wedding celebration. It is not canceled. I don't know why. But they do go through with it. And again, the rioters, they wait out of respect. They let it parade through the streets. I imagine a bunch of them were literally in the crowds watching the parade. And they kind of wave as Hildegard goes past with her husband. And then, Ludwig is also part of the parade, and he goes past, and you can imagine, then the crowd goes silent. They're all just kind of staring daggers at him as he passes. And then, after the parade is done, after the festivities are done for the day, then they go back to the Marderbräu and other breweries like it, and they say, hey, we want cheap beer. And here's the funny thing that happens. The brewers, after that first day, they're like, yeah, okay, we're lowering the price of beer. They don't, they fold. And they lower it. I think it was either 5 or 6 kreuzer that first day. I think it was 6 is what they're saying. Oh yeah, we're lowering it. That's the old price. We're not going with the price increase. We're cool, right? And the riders go, nope, beer costs 5 kreuzer now. And then they're like, wait, what? We can't do that. And then the riders erupt again. It's a total repeat of that first day. I don't know why the Marderbräu didn't just close. That's a good question. But they apparently had some leftover glasses and stools and whatnot in the back room that they brought out because they all got destroyed again. And they continue through the night again. They occasionally move on, the rioters, and they also attack like municipal buildings that are associated. Again, this is a government set price. It's not just, the brewers being greedy or anything like that. And it's only on the third day when the city finally kind of gets ahead of it. And they call all off-duty soldiers to remain in the barracks. They don't let them wander the streets anymore. And they take other steps to kind of divide and conquer the crowds a little bit so they're not able to gather and reach that critical mass that they had during the first 2 days. And it's only on that third day that they're able to start muting the violence. That's just one riot. I've found instances of dozens of others that have taken place between the 1840s and the 1870s across southern and western Germany. And they all tend to follow this same rough pattern where the government pushes for higher prices or just the brewers themselves do. It kind of depends on local laws. There's that same kind of ritual, that ritual of going into the place of business, demanding beer at what's considered a fair price. And if they're refused, then, erupting into violence and doing that targeted destruction of property, usually not harm against people, but occasionally that does happen. And in many cases, this does work. It does secure lower prices. In other cases, it doesn't. And in some more extreme cases, it leads to, soldiers firing on rioters in the street over the price of beer. Wow. That happens a little bit later in Frankfurt in 1873, but it leaves at least a dozen people dead, as I recall. It was pretty horrific.
This was like a strange time in Europe. Mm-hmm. So it was like the Industrial Revolution, in the industry. There were more people that maybe used to be countrymen. They were living in the cities depending on wages. Mm-hmm. I think that goes hand in hand with the rise of breweries as well, because it seems that breweries were more geared towards urban setting, with a lot of customers working nearby. It's pretty cool. It's also like Dickens too, wasn't Dickens? He wrote in this era, didn't he?
He did, yeah. I think A Christmas Carol was written like 1842, something like that.
Yeah, so if you just try to picture what the world was, what Europe was like at that time, I can't get my head around it. But how did you find the story? Like, I've read some of your stories, and last time we talked about the first kegger in Montana. I know you had a podcast for a while on good beer hunting. Yeah. How did you start researching this story?
So this Munich 1844 riot, most of what I've been able to glean about that, like, again, I gotta plug Kim Newak Carpenter, who just wrote a fantastic dissertation on this and dug up lots of sources that were like straight out of Munich City archives and things like that, and really dug into this and brought that story to life. So that's kind of how I learned about Munich and the 1844 instance. But that kind of raised my antenna, and I've been kind of looking for more a little bit here and there ever since. And I mean, I found them. I mean, this Munich riot led to like some 25 aftershock demonstrations throughout Bavaria and like various smaller towns. You go through the late 1840s and 50s. This thread of riot, even when it doesn't happen, it's there almost every year. And it does. It happens in 1848. It happens in 1850. And there's even smaller demonstrations other times in between. And even if it doesn't happen, it's only because the government is able to like pull the levers of the beer price and like, control the military and like police presence. And they're able to kind of manipulate those things just right in order to keep violence from getting widespread. But this was a pretty consistent worry or factor throughout much of, mid-19th century Germany. But part of the reason that I was even looking at all is what is culminating in some research I'm doing now, and that's the part I haven't gotten to yet in all of this. This is all happening in Germany in the 1840s. What else is happening in Germany in the 1840s is literally about 1.5 million Germans, mostly from that southern and western part of the modern day national borders, are immigrating to the United States. And they're taking their beliefs about beer with them. That's kind of my bread and butter. That's what I've researched more independently in the past for my own scholarship. And now what I'm doing is I'm creating scholarship that's linking the two things together and showing how this food riot, showing how this beer riot mentality, how these practices, the ritualistic type of violence or whatever, it got adapted into American contexts during the 1850s and even a little bit beyond. The place I focus on is actually Chicago, which has a locally famous event called the Lager Beer Riot in 1855. And part of what I'm trying to show is that, this is not just a story of local color in the city's history, but rather this is, an instance where American politics and German kind of cultural customs were really clashing in a way that no one quite expected, where these German immigrants were using a European playbook to try and, influence American politics in a way that Americans just did not see coming.
Wow. All right, Ryan, I'm going to take a short break because we're going to come back and talk more about Chicago in 1855 when we come back on Beer Sessions Radio. All right.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. Wisconsin, the state of cheese, makes half of the nation's specialty cheese and wins more awards than any other state or country. Our heritage and traditions, master cheesemaker program, and the American propensity for innovation all put Wisconsin on the cutting edge of cheesemaking. With over 600 varieties of cheese to choose from and 5,500 national and international awards and counting, get ready to turn your refrigerator into a trophy case. Enjoying a Wisconsin cheese is basically like winning a gold medal in culinary achievement. Set your mind at cheese. When you bite into a wedge of Wisconsin Wonderful, you know it is made with the ultimate skill and passion possible. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
Hey, welcome back to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. Support us, become a member, heritageradionetwork.org. Thanks for another great year, our 15th year, 2024. This is our final show of the year, and we're back in the new year in 2025. So my guest, Brian Alberts, we're talking beer history, and we're talking riots. So Brian, we talked a little bit about Munich, and we're in the middle of the industrial era.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of workers, low wages, and they all end up coming to America. So that's where we are now. And tell us about the Germans coming to America and what you're studying in your core research, which happens to overlap with beer.
That's right. Yeah. Boy, I'm going on and on.
I love it. This is great.
Yeah, absolutely. The 1840s and 50s, about 1.5 million Germans come to the United States. predominantly they come from southern and western regions, not exclusively, but the bulk of them do. A lot of them are, working class people, whether it's, urban laborers or farmers, or people like that. A lot of historians like to talk about, kind of the upper crust, the artisans and the professionals, and their influence as members of this kind of late 1840s immigration rush. But really, the bulk of them were just, everyday working class people. And yeah, they brought over their beliefs and their attitudes about beer. And that not only seeded, modern beer culture in the United States as we know it, but it also carried with it this kind of streak of violence, this belief that, well, if beer is a right, then we are going to defend that right. And that gets a little bumpy in those early years when Americans who are in the throes of the temperance movement, you think about prohibition as a 1920s thing, but it was also attempted as an 1850s thing. And the two trends are absolutely linked. So, Germans are coming over to this United States that is a young country that is experimenting with its attitudes toward alcohol, and they have their very strong beliefs about beer. And in places like Chicago, but there were other places as well, that really kind of it comes to a head, if you'll excuse the pun, in the mid 1850s when Americans who don't like immigration and who don't like alcohol start forming political alliances and they start trying to ban the stuff, and it gets kind of hairy.
Yeah, it was definitely more interesting talking about the riots in Germany where it was over the price of beer, but yet how important beer was to their lives. And now when you get to America, you're talking about, pre-prohibition attitudes.
They are, absolutely. When Germans come over to the United States, beer remains often an important part of their lives. Not all German immigrants drank, but a lot of them did. And it's not necessarily seen as nourishment in the kind of everyday way that it was in Munich, but it's seen as absolutely culturally vital for German immigrant communities who, now suddenly they may have been, my neighbors are in. I live in the United States now. My neighbors are Saxon and I'm Bavarian. And if we still lived in Germany, we would have had lots of things to argue about, the Saxons do it this way, the Bavarians do it this way, but now in the United States, everyone just paints us as German or they just call us Dutch, which, was not accurate at all. And they just paint us with this very broad brush. And so now, even though there's things we would have quibbled about back in Europe, we're going to, find common ground a lot more readily because we have this kind of common, not enemy, but this common outside force that we have to reconcile with day to day that comes with good and bad aspects to it. And so beer become this cultural rallying point where it's still absolutely necessary to life. It's seen as a core element of what's called festive culture, which is, we have our work life, we have church, we have home, but we need a place to go. We need a place to cultivate the rest of ourselves. And that is beer gardens, that is social clubs that have beer. They are parades, it's music concerts, all these types of cultural things. And beer is absolutely greasing all of those events. And for Germans, this belief, this Krugerechtigkeit seeds this new version of the same basic idea that beer is important.
So Brian, now you're making me think about, the rise of baseball in America. That was an urban sport. That's where there were, people needed recreation. And it seems that the idea of getting a beer at a ball game, does that go back to this era? Because it's not like you go there and get a vodka. It's not like you get a glass of wine. It's a beer and at a baseball game. Does that go back to this era?
I can't say for sure, but I can basically say that if Germans were involved, there was a keg of beer in the corner. And so if they were going to the game, they found a way to incorporate beer into it. I mean, these people brought beer into the opera, if it was, and also they would hold like shooting competitions. They were called like Schützenfests. And they would, they're literally handling guns and they got glasses of beer sitting next to them as they do it. So if there was a way to incorporate beer into baseball and Germans were involved, you bet they did. Definitely.
This is good. You're onto something. I think you can really go deep with it. So what is it to bring us to Chicago beer riots?
Yep.
What is it that pushed? It wasn't the price of beer in Chicago. What was it that pushed the German workers over the edge, or activated them, if you want to call it activating them politically?
It was an attempt to ban beer. Beer is a very contentious thing in Chicago history. It's a fascinating way to understand the city better. I'm sure New York is no different. But so in the mid 1850s, the temperance movement is in full swing. They're trying to just limit alcohol any way they can. Germans are becoming a bigger and bigger part of the city. They're like 20% of the city at this time, population wise. And, the Irish immigrants are another 20% on top of that. And these both are richly, these are both cultures with rich alcohol traditions. And if you're a temperance person who wants to limit alcohol, going after immigrants is a great way to do it. And there was a totally separate faction on top of them called the American Party, or the Know Nothings, or the Nativists. All those terms kind of apply. And they didn't like immigrants. And so in the mid 1850s in Illinois, but in other places too, these two factions start realizing they can ally together. Because if you want to get rid of alcohol, you go through immigrants to do it. And if you want to get rid of immigrants, or at least to marginalize them, you go through alcohol to do it. And so there's just kind of
and you keep them from gathering.
Absolutely. If you want to bring a meme into it, that Predator meme with the two really big bicep arms, going in to do that handshake. I mean, that's what happens, right, in 1855. And they realize that, hey, together we are much stronger. We can achieve both our goals at the same time. And so in 1855, this happens. The Nativist Party manages to sweep the local elections. They get the mayor, they get the city council, they get all the major offices. And they basically have free reign to enact their agenda as they want to. And so they immediately work to restrict alcohol in the city. There's a slightly bigger context here where Illinois was in the process of considering a prohibition law at the time that would have banned alcohol statewide. This thing is on the cusp of being passed. It has passed the state general assembly, and basically all that needs to happen at that point is a referendum on the city, a referendum of the state general voters to pass this law and put it on the books. And so the leaders of Chicago, these nativist leaders that take over, headed by a guy named Levi Boone, he believes this is just a formality. He thinks it's going to happen. And so in his mind, because he obviously knows better than all these immigrants about what they should be thinking, in his mind, he needs to prepare these unwashed immigrants for sobriety. And so he needs to start like winding down alcohol in the city early in order to pave the way for this law. And so he starts basically refusing to issue liquor licenses. He makes it prohibitively expensive. He starts enforcing a dead law that was on the books about closing taverns on Sundays. And these are, Sunday was the only day off of work that you had at that time. And so he starts targeting immigrant neighborhoods and enforcing these laws very heavily. He gives like no warning. Like he announces that the Sunday law is going to be enforced late on a Saturday, and then just arrests everybody the next day. And this wasn't the days of Twitter.
So you got arrested if you were a tavern owner and you opened. Yep. You were arrested if you were a drinker.
The drinkers, I don't think got arrested. It was the tavern owners who were arrested and fined. Yeah.
And so just to give them credit, so that the German and Irish immigrants, they work 6 days a week, long hours.
Yep.
And so Sunday was their day part of their day, they would gather in the pubs.
Exactly.
Or beer gardens.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And to oppose this law, you get like the tavern owners, you get like the liquor wholesalers and other, types of people who work in the industry that way. They start organizing kind of this political resistance. They form a newspaper, they petition the government, they do these like kind of civil actions to try and oppose the law legally. But they need support, they need popular support, and they find it in immigrant neighborhoods. And I don't think even though those people are on the same side as the immigrants in opposing these restrictions and trying to keep alcohol kind of flowing freely in the city, I don't think they realized what they were signing up for, because the more lower class, rank and file of the opposition in the city, they're a lot more boisterous. They're a lot more angry. And when enough of these people have been arrested in Chicago, the rest of the city, the immigrant communities, they take to the streets, and they take to the streets in ways that are remarkably similar to what I was kind of just talking about in Munich. Not necessarily in the smashing of glasses and tables, because they weren't mad. The U.S. was a different situation. They weren't mad at the tavern owners because the tavern owners weren't part of the problem. They were victims alongside the drinkers. So they don't go and smash up the taverns, but they do gather at the taverns, and then they do these kind of performative moves downtown and kind of swarm City Hall and try to make themselves heard without the violence. But again, this is the United States and not Germany. And so the mayor, who does not really, know this dance the way that Munich's officials would have, he just calls the cops on him, and it leads to this riot in the street, this brawl with cops in the street. At least one person dies, a few other people are injured and shot, things like that. And the mayor actually has to turn the center of the City Hall kind of square, into this big war zone. He literally deploys War of 1812 era cannon on the city to protect it, while these kind of crowds are roaming the street, and it's a surprisingly interesting kind of dynamic that goes on. And so I think it's a situation where kind of this old world pattern for this is how we deal with these problems. This is how we deal with threats to our access to beer. And this, United States thinking of well, we just we use political machinations to solve these issues, and we use the ballot box and all that kind of stuff, and German immigrants don't think that way. It only is later when they start to think that way.
Wow. So Brian, are you researching a book on this now?
I'm writing a book chapter. So sometimes academics will get together and they do what's called an edited volume, where they kind of pick a unifying theme, but then different people write different chapters that all fit under the theme, but they aren't all the same story. So I'm working on a chapter about that. Yeah.
And what's the general theme? Is it just beer, Germans, workers, immigrants?
It's actually I don't want to say too much yet because it's still kind of in the earlier stages. But it's basically about various mind-altering substances during the Civil War era. So alcohol obviously is included in that, but other contributors to the volume talk about tobacco or opium, or they talk about various types of medicines like quinine, things like that. Caffeine is fair game. That kind of stuff. Yeah, anything that kind of is material culture that kind of alters people's state of mind, and how it affected Civil War medicine, how it affected, policy with the soldiers, or in my case, national politics, that kind of stuff. It's all fair game. And there's some really exciting work in there.
I was reading a little bit about Civil War recently, and it said that the Union, so one factor benefiting the Union soldiers was that they had access to coffee. I don't know if you read that. And the Confederates may not have, and they had to resort to chicory and other things.
I totally believe it.
Yeah. It's always great talking to you. I love reading through this. I sometimes when I think about temperance and pre-prohibition, I kind of tense up, and it's because so much of that story it's almost a stereotype now when you hear about, rum runners and speakeasies and stuff, but we don't really talk about this era where it was forming. I mean, there was a lot of other movements involved, but it seems like that from what I've heard and read is that the anti-immigrant component may have been one of the bigger aspects of the temperance movement. But also, the last thing I want to add in, I think that the bigger picture was that it was the industrialization, and that there were a lot of people in urban areas looking for work, working, and not making enough money. I think that all that together, and then the need for more workers, so immigrants came to our country. I don't know if you've read anything that's put the whole picture together, or if you yourself could sum up a neat way to say, what was going on in the country at that time. It's almost like temperance was just one more way to, I don't know, act politically. I'm not sure.
I think it was a little bit more than that. If you're talking about the mid 19th century, I mean, obviously, before the Civil War, slavery was the dominant political debate and point of division of that time period. Yes, but but behind that, the second place issue was alcohol, absolutely, and the temperance movement. Also, we know that Prohibition happened, of course, in 1920 to 1933. But the arguments that seeded Prohibition and also seeded a lot of the defenses against it were actually formed in the 1850s. Uh, the beer industry would become one of the major opponents and kind of defenders against the Prohibition movement. And that was headed up by German immigrants all the way up through, the onset in 1920. A lot of the arguments they were advancing about beer's supposed healthful qualities, about how it's a moderate alternative to harder liquors, about how it's the societal benefits it has and things like that. Those were all formulating in the 1850s. And as I was just kind of talking about with the riot patterns, these were ideas that were born in Germany and adapted to an American context. They weren't generated here. And that's, that goes much deeper than just saying, they were immigrants. It's actually, it very much is a deep running vein in Bavarian culture, or I should say Southern German culture, not just Bavaria, that absolutely formulated the basis for, I mean, lobbying efforts and industry, big industry-wide efforts and arguments against the Prohibition movement going all the way up to 1920. And for the most part, they worked, by the way. It was in the late, it was World War I that created a lot of anti-German sentiment in the United States, and that eroded a lot of those arguments right as the Prohibition movements and societies in the United States were making one of their big pushes. And that's part of why, the phalanx finally broke, was that suddenly being German was a bad thing. Whereas, for about 50, 70 years before that, German culture and beer culture were seen generally as positives by anyone who wasn't a temperance advocate in the United States. And so, it's a very long running thing that goes back to the 1850s.
It's really, and I've heard about that in New York, where even in Chinatown, before World War One, the word Ratskeller, for example, was commonly used as a basement cellar. Could have been a Chinese Ratskeller, could have been a lot of different things. It was common usage, and I've also heard that people changed their last names from German names. That's a whole other story too. It's quite interesting how complex that whole thing was with Prohibition. But I still like the idea that the beer was nourishing. That's my takeaway. That because even whether a lot of cultures, you would say, maybe limit access to hard alcohol. Maybe that needs, but beer and wine and cider, there's some benefits. And one thing I like about being on the radio as opposed to working in the industry is that we can speculate on health benefits.
Yeah.
You can't advertise health benefits of alcohol, but there's a lot of them. And it sounds like even the workers in Chicago in 1855, that Sunday and in the beer hall or the beer garden was probably that one thing that made their lives bearable, I'm sure. With their friends and their family, and
it was a huge part of it, absolutely. And it got so popular that non-Germans started kind of trickling in to those same celebrations as the years went on. Yep, in Chicago newspapers after in the years after the riot, they're talking. There's little reports about like, oh yeah, Americans, they're sneaking across the river into the German side of town and heading to the beer gardens on Sundays. And there's a certain amount of bitterness if you're a temperance person watching that happen.
Sounds like Harlem in the 1920s. Something
Probably.
Like that.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Brian, listen, always great talking to you. I saw you were drinking a beer. You want to give a shout out to what you're drinking?
I tried to kind of keep in the spirit of the occasion. So I actually have two here. I didn't drink them both, but I had the Eyinger Celebrator Doppelbock, which is kind of just classic Doppelbock.
Good one.
Probably close to what the beer would have been like in the 1840s Munich. And then I got a local one out here, Chuckanut Dunkel Lager. Chuckanut makes some of the most fantastic lagers in the Pacific Northwest. I did not get paid to say that, but I would accept beer if they want to give it
Brian,
to me.
Where are you based?
I'm based in Washington State, but originally I'm from the Chicago area, suburbs outside the city.
That's great. And I'm about to pop old school Aventinas, Schneider Aventinas.
Nice.
The Doppelweizenbock, which that might be my meal tonight. I'll see how nourishing it is. Okay.
Yeah, see how you feel after.
Yeah. Well, listen, these are great beers to toast with. Eyinger, Celebrator, Doppelbock. And once again, what's your Chuckanut?
Chuckanut, just their Dunkellager. And
Chuckanut,
you can see
Doppelbock,
it. The radio can't.
Eyinger, Snyder,
Celebrator, yep.
Aventinus. Three great beers to toast the holidays. A great style of beer if we want to talk about holiday beers. And I'm ready for the holiday season. Let's drink Doppelbox and Doppelweissbox. And thanks, Brian. Really appreciate it.
Yep.
And happy holidays. Okay.
Happy holidays. Can't wait to ring in the new year with one of these.
All right. And we'll catch up with everyone later. Thanks, Brian Alberts. Thanks, Gabe, for being our engineer. Happy holidays, everyone. And we'll catch you again in 2025 on Beer Sessions Radio. All right. Thanks so much, guys.